Okay, Matt. Just tell her to turn her camera on. We're ready to start.
Okay, yeah, here she comes. Hi, good morning. Hi, I'm introducing you today, not Professor Hoffman, so welcome. Welcome to the Miles and Elena Zaremski Noontime Forums. These are named after our alumnus, Miles Zaremski, and his wife, Elena, who generously endowed this noontime series of talks for students in person and for people online wishing CLE credit. Our speaker today, Jacqueline Fox, is professor of law at the Joseph Rice School of Law at the University of South Carolina. She received her JD and her LLM from Georgetown University. She was a postdoctoral Greenwald Fellow at Johns Hopkins in Georgetown. She was a Donahue visiting scholar in research ethics at Yale. And she recently completed a Fulbright scholarship at the Uhiro Center for Practical Ethics at Oxford and Melbourne Law School. Were you actually in Australia?
Yes, I was.
Wow. Was Julian there? Was he in, I'm sorry, folks. Was he in Singapore? Did you see?
I think he was in Singapore. I'm actually going to Singapore in a few weeks to see them there.
Oh, good. Well, yeah, we had Jerry Manikoff was here on this past Friday for a meeting, and he's from, he's there with Julian, so you'll see him. Okay, well, research interests, Professor Fox focuses on intersection of law and policy, particularly with regard to healthcare financing and bioethics. Currently, she's studying methods used to calculate how much we spend on healthcare and how we spend money on healthcare can do good or bad. Her title today is The Financialization of Healthcare. And so without more, please welcome Professor Fox.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to present this paper, and thank you. I'm just going to jump right in and explain kind of the overarching research undertaking of doing, and then how this fits into it, and then move into that, if that makes sense. So I've been working on the financialization, like on financing of healthcare systems for a really long time. I write about insurance, about bioethics related to like social justice theory, stuff like that. And as I was doing that, I've quoted these numbers. I think we all have. The United States spends X number of dollars a year on healthcare, those kind of numbers, really without thinking much about it. And then I was reading a Congressional Budget Office, a CBO, scaling of how much a national health insurance plan would cost. And as I was reading it, I started to feel like there were these sort of undercurrents of communication when they were talking about how unsure they were about the prices. Because, when they say cost, they always put the conditions in there and the assumptions they're making. And I started to get curious, and it took me a really long time to actually convince someone from the CBO to meet with me and let me talk through what was going on. But it started me on this long project, which I'm really just in the middle of now, about understanding accounting methodologies and how really important I think they are to what we're doing with healthcare financing, and just teasing out some big issues about that. And I get that thinking about accounting methodologies probably isn't the most exciting thing when you first think about it. But one of the things I've learned through my research so far is this whole idea of the rhetoric of accounting, which is actually really understood in academic accounting areas, which is that the numbers that they communicate have this effect on people where we believe them as being a true statement when they recognize that they're conditional, and they've got a lot of the things that happen in there, a lot of changes that happen that reflect values, that reflect decisions that have to be made about what will count or not count. And the way I describe it is that if I say I have 50 apples in a bucket and there are 50 people in the room, it's reasonable to expect that I will be able to give one apple to each of the 50 people in there, because my numbers are counting real things like the apples. But when we say how much we spend on healthcare in the United States, that is not a bunch of dollars that you could actually touch. It's so much more nuanced and complicated than that. So I want to tease out, like, what is this doing? How is this affecting us? And can we use accounting methodologies by improving them to maybe do a better job at providing healthcare to people? All right, so that's like my big thing. And I want to compare it to how this rhetoric and how the accounting methodologies differ from country to country. That's how I ended up doing the Fulbright, is that I went to Oxford and then Australia because there are 3 different financing systems and 3 different accounting methodologies and 3 different sort of outcomes and political rhetoric associated with spending, which really helped me clarify sort of what the problems are and some approaches to them. This is an enormous project, if I'm being frank, and I'm just in the thick of it. This is the 2nd article I've done. I'm working on 2 other ones after this. So this is going to be a long project of teasing it out. So the first article appeared in FIU Law Review, and it's on the Medicare drug price negotiation program that started. And I was using that to try and understand what cost does. Like when we are talking about cost, what are we talking about? And what I started to realize was that money in the United States is our primary form of rationing healthcare, I feel. And I think I did a pretty good job in that article of explaining that big claim, but doing it in a pretty tight way. I'm not going to repeat the whole thing now, but that's sort of, I'm working under that assumption, right? And that when you say that the cost is our primary form of rationing healthcare, that starts to say that when you're a price setter or a profit seeker, you're creating foreseeable downstream problems as a result of the price that you set and as a result of the profit that you're extracting from the system, right? And it could be just, I set a price for a drug and someone can't buy the drug and there's a downstream effect of them not getting the medication. It could be more complicated. I'm pulling resources out of a system with scarce resources, and so there aren't enough resources to go around. But my theory was that when you're a participant who enters a market and sets these prices or extracts this profit, ethically speaking, you have some obligation of justification, right? Like, why is it I should be entitled to this in a system that has scarce resources and where my behaviors that are under my control have this foreseeable potential negative downstream effect on people? Right? So it's like an ethical argument within that financing system. And then what I do in that thing is I start to talk about who we're looking to save money in healthcare. That right now, generally speaking, we look at patients, we look at doctors, we look at hospitals, and we say, can we make you more efficient? Do you need more skin in the game? How do we bend the cost curve, focusing on that? And I feel that I have a pretty strong argument for flipping that and saying the first place we should look is actually people who provide no care, have no patient contact, and are engaged in what I would call I'm not the only one calling it this, financialization of healthcare, right? That someone who's just profiting through a financing mechanism at the very top should be the first place we look and say, why are you getting money out of this system with scarce resources? So that's sort of that whole article, like sets me up then to be looking with some suspicion and demands for justification at certain actors in the healthcare system. Does that all make sense? Is everyone sort of following that? Okay. Yeah. Okay. That was a yes hand. I wasn't. Okay. So this piece, which is going to be published in the American Journal of Law and Medicine, right, is actually called Unmasking the Financialization of Healthcare. And there are a lot of people who write about private equity in healthcare. I'm certainly not the only person. Aaron Fuse Brown is absolutely brilliant about this. Bagley is fantastic. I mean, there are a lot of really smart people in this field. What I'm bringing to it that's a little different is kind of blaming everyone. I feel like I'm from my bioethical background, I'm pretty good at saying thou shalt not and one ought to. So what I am talking about here is how the methods we use to add up how much we spend on healthcare are inadvertently masking this enormous financialization of healthcare, and so misleading us as to how much money we're actually spending on healthcare. And so to get more of a sense of this, I have a formula that's in the article, and I put it in the chat. I don't know if you guys can all see this in the chat, but I'm going to repeat it. I'll walk you through it. It's just, I put it in there because it's easier. I don't have a blackboard to write on here with you guys, and it's easier to do that. But what I want you to understand is this is not math. This is more algebraic relationships. It's similar in a way to Learned Hand's theory of liability and tort, right? Where we're looking at the relationship between like burdens and risk of injury and that sort of thing, right? And where it's fair to shift things. I'm sort of doing a similar way of trying to holistically capture everything, if that makes sense. All right. So I'm going to walk you through the formula, and then I'm going to sort of explain more in detail about what I'm doing. But I love this formula. It's really been useful in teaching the healthcare financing system so far since I've been doing it, because it just sort of crystallizes sort of what we're talking about. So in this, I'm saying that N, right, is what we spend on healthcare with our current calculations, like what you might hear in the cost of healthcare in the United States is, or the cost of healthcare per capita in the United States is, that would be N, right? Usually followed by a lament. Why, if we spend so much on healthcare, do we get such poor outcomes for this population or for that condition? I think we're all familiar with those phrasing, right? The United States spends more on healthcare than anyone else with these terrible outcomes. That sort of concept, that's the N, right? HS is what we actually spend on healthcare. Okay, so what I want to do is get from N to HS. I want to figure out what things are improperly being included as spending on healthcare when they're really part of what I call financialization. All right, the things that relate to profit extraction that aren't really, in my eyes, and what I'm arguing in this article, providing care to patients. Okay. So the formula would be that we want to subtract F, right, financialization, from N, right, to come up with this. But what I realized in working through my article is that it's a little more complicated than this. And this is where I learned from Learned Hand, I guess, that the costs of financialization are not just the money that's being extracted by price setting or profit seeking or any of those things, right? The costs of this are also the harms that are being caused through this, through erroneous price setting, through not having sufficient resources in a system because they're being extracted, through the debt loads that these hospitals are carrying that I'll talk about in a second. Like, those are causing some distinct harms, and they have to properly be included in this if we're really getting an answer of what we're truly spending on healthcare versus what the effects of financialization are. So I'm trying to wrestle with that right now. That's where I'm at, of where that fits into this. What I have so far is then to calculate HS, which is healthcare spending, right? You have to add up financialization and these other costs. So that would be F plus C, like the foreseeable damages that are being caused by it, right? Subtract that from N, which is the number that's being used, right? And then you get HS. So it's basically the number that we're given that we spend on healthcare minus financialization and the damages caused by financialization will tell us what we really spend on healthcare. And the reason I think this matters is well, for a lot of reasons. Hopefully that was coherent, by the way. It's hard to do this without writing it on a blackboard, but just follow the gist of it, if that makes sense. Because again, I'm not going to ask you to do the math and come up with any numbers. The idea is that if we could properly identify what we're spending on healthcare, it also shows us what we're spending that isn't going to healthcare, right? And it starts pointing towards types of actors in this. And those actors I've got roughly sorted into three groups. You have the, let me see, where's my list of the three groups here? We've got rent-seeking behavior, which would be, for example, a private equity firm comes in with a real estate investment trust, and the private equity firm purchases a hospital using money that they've borrowed to finance the purchase, right? And they pay someone some money for the hospital, and they own a share of it. And the hospital owns the ground that they're on, right? That the hospital's on. And then the real estate investment trust purchases the underlying land and leases it back to the hospital, which is jointly owned by the private equity firm and whoever's still remaining as an owner in the hospital, right? The money that comes in through that purchase, right? It's a huge amount of cash because very often these hospitals are in very expensive parts of the cities, right? So this money comes in, and then very often it's promptly distributed as a distribution to shareholders of the private equity firm. Then now the hospital no longer owns the land, and they're on the hook for lease payments every month, not mortgage payments. They're not buying it back or anything. And they didn't get any of the money from the the sale leaseback. Like we're saying, it gets distributed as the dividend-like distribution, right, to the shareholders or owners of this private equity firm. And so I feel like if we're, so anyway, so that's profit seekers. Then we have price setters, right? And that would be someone who has like some sort of legal protection for the thing that they're selling. So it would be like a drug maker, right, has market exclusivity. It would be a device maker that has something like that, where there are barriers to entry and competition, right? And so they are setting a price, and the price is very sticky. Like you have to pay that price to get the thing. For those, I consider those people then who are setting excess prices as a concept, as being another form of this financialization and pulling money out of the system. And there are a lot of citations to other people's work in my article that explain like I'm not inventing these concepts. I'm like borrowing them to put them in this list. And then the third kind would be the gamesmanship people, the money that's being spent on gamesmanship. So we've got rent seeking, which is like profit seeking of the kind I just described, like where you have financial shenanigans kind of that are extracting these huge chunks of money out of the system. Then you have unreasonable price setting, where someone has this power to set a price that's in excess of what we would say is a reasonable price for what they're doing, right? And then gamesmanship is where there's a government program that's in place meant to incentivize certain kinds of behavior, usually to ensure that people who are disadvantaged in some way or vulnerable populations get access to high quality care. And so people step in and build structures around that that's pulling the money through that opening to create profit that's in excess of what's actually going towards the vulnerable populations. The most common example of this is there's a federal program for helping hospitals in poorer areas provide drugs to their patients. And what you do is you fold that lower income hospital into a really big hospital system and funnel all the pharmaceutical purchases through there to get this enormous amount of money going to the hospitals that don't really fit that. So that would be an example of gamesmanship. So the idea being that, and I understand that there are issues of identifying all of these clearly, don't get me wrong, but I think that if you add all of those up, you're capturing something where it's simply not going towards the provision of healthcare. It's not providing care to patients, it's actually weakening the system, right? The example that I use in my paper about this is the one with Steward Healthcare, which I think most people are pretty familiar with at this point because it was just so appalling. But I want to talk a little bit, and I'm going to use my notes here because I just want to make sure I get the numbers entirely accurate in saying this. So what happened was that Medical Properties Trust, which is the real estate investment trust that's been a huge player in this internationally, right? Is commonly does these sale leasebacks with struggling hospitals in the United States, right? Where private equity firms come in and they purchase a hospital and then they do this partnership with this real estate investment trust. So Steward Healthcare System started where Cerberus Capital Management purchases a set of hospitals in Massachusetts, right? And they create a new entity called Steward Healthcare Systems. And this is in 2010. The Massachusetts government was very suspicious of this and had them under like watch for the first 6 years that they existed. In 2016, right after this monitoring ended, Steward sells all the underlying real estate in these hospitals to MPT, which is the Real Estate Investment Trust, right? For $1.2 billion. And Cerberus, which is still owning a big share of Steward Health, immediately issues a $484 million dividends to its shareholders from that $1.2 billion, right? So you see that the money just leaves, right? So now these struggling hospitals are responsible for the lease payments on the land that they had owned before then, right? So then in 2020, the hospital group is rapidly expanding and had 11 hospitals, it moves to 30. They keep doing these sale leasebacks. And Cerberus gets bought out by a physician group, right, who funds the purchase with a $335 million loan from the same real estate investment trust that owns the underlying property. So everyone following this? So we're seeing changes in ownership and we're adding more debt each time something happens. So people aren't buying it with money in their hand, they're buying it through debt funding. and just changing who has ownership interest in this rapidly expanding group of hospitals. Tons of other things start happening. They can't have income streams sufficient to manage the debt obligations they have. They keep entering into refinancing agreements. Most of those are with this same real estate investment trust, okay, MPT. By May 6, 2024, they filed for bankruptcy protection with over $9 billion in liabilities. $9 billion, right? And most of it were lease liabilities, long-term lease liabilities owned by MPT. So you see this extraordinary set of extractions happening, like every possible dime they could pull out of this system they have. And the quality of the hospitals during this whole time was plummeting. Like, there are testimony you can find in Massachusetts government and in other states that had these hospitals of patients dying unnecessarily, of doctors not being paid, et cetera. So I'm not exaggerating like the degree of problems with these things. And I think everyone understands that private equity is presenting a significant problem to healthcare, right? So why, though, do I think that what I'm suggesting adds something? I think that we need to be teasing out more what these costs are and how they relate to what we're spending on other things. And my underlying theory, and I suspect this is right, is that in fact, we're spending too little on healthcare. Not that we're spending too much on healthcare, that we're spending too much on the healthcare system as it's currently financed. But the health dollars simply aren't going where they should be. But I can't know that for sure, right? Until we start calculating more accurately what this stuff is. The things I think we get, like, as a real concrete benefit from changing our accounting systems to start trying to tease this money out and requiring it to be accounted for and reported, is, first of all, holding the correct actors responsible for foreseeable harms that their activities actually cause. I understand that there's a distinction between tort liability or regulatory liability and ethical obligations, but I think it's very difficult to come in and create a regulatory scheme without first fleshing out the ethical obligations. I think that if you look at the qualities that we're asking people to be forthcoming about in the drug negotiation plan that came out of the CARES Act, that's really sussing out your ethical obligations and what's a fair and reasonable price for you to be charging for your behavior. I think we're starting to get close to language that has that, but I'm trying to make it like concrete and knowable, right? This is an ethical harm you're causing. Can you explain why in the balance it's okay for you to get that money given what you're causing, right? So I think it helps us identify those people and hold them responsible. But the other thing is, again, as I was saying from the beginning, it helps us understand that we may be spending too little on things that we value and spending too much on things that have no value at all for our actual healthcare system. And then finally, I think that it helps us identify specific areas where we could be affecting change, even as we're far from perfect understanding about what financialization does. And that would be, for example, with the example I gave about the sale leasebacks with private equity coming in, I think states should have laws that prohibit an extraction like that, where it turns into a distribution. Like, these are primarily nonprofit hospitals that have benefited greatly from nonprofit status, both at the state and federal level, and they're highly regulated by the states. And hospitals, even when they're not nonprofit, serve an enormous benefit to the community. And the value that they develop is because of that, right? They belong there, and that value, to me, belongs to the community. And I think that there should be laws, for example, that say that any funds that come from a sale leaseback should never be permitted to be used for a distribution of profit. Never. That is, it's something that must be held by the hospital for hospital uses, not for profit. I can't see the justification. And I've tried, as a law professor, you try to always be like one side and then the other side. But unless you're stepping outside of the healthcare system and the duties that the healthcare system has to patients, like, unless you're stepping out from there and being like, okay, I just like private equity, or there's like a value to this financialization system separate from healthcare, I don't see any justifications for allowing that to go forward. My next project is looking at, well, there are two I'm working on right now, but the one that's related to this is looking at how community benefit is calculated with hospitals and how can we more robustly understand the value that a hospital holds and how do we protect it? Because I have noticed that this is just the most recent example of what I am in my head calling the pillaging of hospital resources, that you can point to different moments throughout history where they're like, the value that accumulates to them justifiably because of what they're providing to the community, someone figures out a way to tap into it and yank it out. And then the community has to use their resources to build the hospital back up to be a financially stable, functioning entity again, and then it gets pillaged again. And I think that if we can look at it from an accounting perspective and somehow name and clarify, you know what I mean, with boundaries, this is the value, this is how we think it's assessed, we can protect it better from like future attempts to pull that out, because it just sits there, I think, like a soft target. You know, like people are it's attractive to people who want to pull that money out of there because we have protected it insufficiently. And that's kind of related to what I'm doing here, right? The idea that we need to be much more suspicious about the people who literally aren't providing physical care to patients. We need to ask people to do a better job of explaining why they're entitled to any of the money out of the system. And if I'm being really frank, I tend to be very hesitant to put burdens on patients. And that may come from my practice. Before I became a law professor, I represented patients in efforts to gain access to healthcare. And I see what happens to people when they're sick and injured. And I feel very uncomfortable saying, you know, why don't you shop around? Why don't you act better? Why don't you be the one who's the engine of saving money? I've always felt like that's kind of putting a lot on people and asking them to do things they may not be capable of. I have another article about the lived experience of health insurance, which really tries to look at the kind of tasks we put on patients and people purchasing health insurance and the kind of sophistication we're asking them to have as they participate in this marketplace while they're sick. And I'm just not a big fan of it. So that's sort of the energy I'm bringing to this in a way. But I think that my structures and arguments are very sound, even in light of that sort of concern I have. Excuse me. Anyway, that's kind of where I'm at. I'd love your thoughts on this. If you have any questions about what I just presented, I'd love to hear that too. And so I can clarify it. It's a little weird to be so far away from you and not seeing all your eyes as I'm talking. So it's hopefully I'm making sense. And I'm really curious what you all think. And if you can, those people who are listening online, feel free to jump into the chat as well.
Thank you very much. Oh, questions? Andrew, are you monitoring the offline people?
Yeah, I'm taking a look around there, but let's start with some in person if we've got them.
I see it. There it is.
Thanks for being here. So when you run the numbers, or look at your formula, like what % of the total healthcare spending, that end number, ends up being financialization?
That's a really good question. And I'm not sure, but I have some ideas, if that makes sense. So
yeah, do you have like a ballpark or like?
Yeah, I'm going to be lawyerly about this and say that take this with a grain of salt. How's that? And then I'm going to sound super authoritative as I give you an answer. I'm going to say it's somewhere between 1/3 and 45%. I think it's quite high. I think that it comes and goes, you know, as different things are trending. But I think if you look at just how much pressure is on these healthcare providers to service debt that's just being pulled out of there. If you look at how prices reflect market power rather than the cost of developing the drugs and things like that, I think it's substantial. And when I say substantial, I think at least 1/3. And some of that is comparing us to other countries that are leaner and don't have these things. And it's also private equity has been moving into other countries over the last 5 to 10 years. And you can see what starts happening over there, particularly in England. And so I'm just getting a general sense in that way that it's pretty substantial. I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but that's about all I've got. What do you think it is?
I have another question. Is that
Uh,
okay?
Sure.
So it's a very simple question that might be extremely complex in its answer. And that's, you may have hinted at it already. Why does the market fail to regulate like spiraling out of control costs the way you like an Econ 101 student would expect it to? Why can't patients just go to the hospitals that aren't suffering from the extraction and the financialization?
That is a whole semester. Max, I'm pretty sure you're nodding like, yeah, that's, okay, so basically you have to think about who we are when we access healthcare, right? Like where we're at and when we do it. It comes from a lot of different places, right? You could have a long-term relationship with one provider and do that in a way where you understand how much they cost and things, but that's actually becoming less and less common for people to know who their provider is in that long term. Most of the time it's you're sick and you're going to get care, you've got insurance, and the way you're thinking about it is, this is how much my deductible is that I haven't met yet. This is how much my copayment is, I think. I don't know what care I'm going to get, because if I did know what care I was going to get, I'd be the doctor, right? Like I'm going to the doctor because I don't know. So I'm going to find out a lot of things. And what I'm really thinking is, can I handle some crazy deductible and copayment? And if I can't, I'm not going to go until it gets really bad. And if I can, I'm going to kind of grimace and go and hope it's not too bad at the end of the day. Do you see what I mean? And so there's not a lot of room for that kind of thinking. Like, I don't know how many people here have ever gone through the lunacy of purchasing a mattress. But depending on how much time you have and what's involved in it, you can become this weird expert on purchasing mattresses, right? Pretty quickly. Plus, you're getting totally taken advantage of, and then you find out you are. Does everyone know what I'm talking about? It's like there's all these websites, there's all this stuff. That's not happening when you have an inflamed appendix, right? You're Googling, but it's completely confusing you. And then you sort of end up unconscious and things happen. It's so different than how we interact with the marketplace. But I guess the other reason that we can't do that is because the barriers to entry and the tight regulation, the network contracts that are happening between insurance companies and providers, like all of those things are constraining what a marketplace would look like, right? You have patients that have no sophistication really, or else they would be the doctors. You have, do you see what I'm saying? It's just, it's not set up to do that. The way people describe it, like most generously, would be, what is that word? It's like highly regulated and constrained competition, right? Like you're trying to create a system where you harness competition within guardrails so that you're trying to get the best the competition gives you without it running off the rails in what is really not a well-functioning marketplace. Does that make sense? Like that would be the Affordable Care Act tries to do that with insurance. I don't know what that answered, but it's my best shot.
Thank you. We have a question from online, which is, what are the likely economics arguments you expect to be raised by parasitic entities in defense of the parasitism? And what legal arguments do you expect them to raise against regulation?
The argument that, I love the phrase parasitic, that's kind of shows me where you are in this, but I'd say that the biggest argument is efficiencies, right? That we come in, so what very often happens is you'll have like a private equity firm that will do this financing mechanism, and they'll be partial owner of a practice group, and they also own a management group that they contract with to come in to manage the practice so that it generates sufficient funds to cover the servicing on the debt and also increase profit. And so they will say, we're really good at this, that the incentive for us to make more money is now lined up with increased efficiencies and qualities if we do this properly. And we'll bring the skill set to you with the metrics we impose on the doctors so that that all improves. There is no data saying that ever happens, but that is the rhetoric, I think, that's commonly used for this. Another one would be that capitalism works, that what we need is to be less fettered, not more fettered, that I think the vernacular would be let them cook, like let them do what they want to do, and that this will work well. The money will go where it's generating the best stuff. Then I actually say in my paper, I'm like, you choose to enter the healthcare system, right? When you're a business, you could make, and the example I use is lawn darts, but you could make something else, right? And when you walk into healthcare, it's so different. The ethics around it are so different. To me, obviously I teach health law, so I think this, but it's a different world than normal goods and services. And so I would argue, push back against their claims about just the value they bring by offering those financial setups and by creating those incentives for profit. The legal argument against regulation, I mean, there are tons of arguments they could be making. I mean, currently we're just not set up in a lot of ways for proper regulation about this. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, doesn't collect data from private equity firms. And that's one of the reasons they can do a lot of stuff without being held accountable. The Stewart Health is unusual because it was so explosive that Massachusetts had them all come in and testify right before the state legislature. And that's why we know so much about this. But a lot of these things are happening under the radar, and they're actually expanding private equity substantially into like our retirement accounts and stuff. They're starting to purchase shares in private equity firms. So it's just getting bigger, and there is no regulatory structure right now, I think, that is in a place to properly govern that, through transparency and through like regulations. So I think that would be the biggest one, but it's not a government taking or anything like that. I don't think they have those claims.
Thank you very much. This has really been very excellent. I have couple questions.
I'm so happy to hear that, by the way.
I hope not the second thing, but the first thing. But I remember, you mentioned, I think you were talking about the 340B program before, and when a for-profit, say, hospital system has to declare what its costs are to what its actual profits are, and some years ago, somebody said to me, there are no required or imposed accounting rules for how hospitals estimate their costs.
Yes.
And since even though I mean, accountants have rules for like how they have to do your tax returns and business, form. So is that still true, that there really are no sort of mandatory accounting rules that they have to follow? I have a follow-up depending on your answer.
Okay, this is such a cool question, and I'm going to try not to totally dork out on this, but no, so a whole lot is happening here, right? When you look at hospital accounting methodologies, and it literally goes back to the Jesuits in the 1600s, devising accounting methodologies about hospitals and what value is and what matters. And they did not see a distinction between financial values and moral values. Right. And so hospitals, I won't go into that. It's really fun, but it's probably like horrible for other people to listen to. But if you're into this, go look it up. It's so cool. But if you watch hospital accounting methodologies over the centuries, you see this constant struggle that hospitals have where they want to do a good, and they're being pressured by those people who are doing the financing to justify it in ways that don't match up with what they see as their mission. Right? Like it might be they want to provide care to every single person who comes into a hospital, but the community only wants them to do it for people they view as the quote unquote deserving poor. Right? So you'll see hospitals trying to hide their mission through their accounting methodologies, like historically. What happened in the United States was somewhere around the 1940s or 50s, there was this push towards trying to get hospitals to do their accounting methodologies to match for-profit large American firms. Like they wanted it to look like that, right? And they were trying to come up with criteria that would make them sound like that, like General Motors, right? But the way they did it was, and this particularly started with the 60s and 70s, through individual billing of individual specific interactions and care provision moments, right, that the hospital had. So like you go to the hospital, you're sick, you get this care, it's billed this way. And so they were trying to force the hospitals to do their accounting based on patients got treated with this, we billed for that, this is the money we got. A hospital would say, and this is what I'm writing about, that's why I'm all excited, right? The hospital would say, we do a lot more. Like our existence here counts for a lot more. Let me give you a really good example. Real estate values. Real estate values in a community reflect a good functioning hospital, right? It's a value that the entire community benefits from, that there's no accounting methodologies for. Hospitals have a capacity to respond to emergencies, right? That this accounting methodology simply doesn't track. The value of the organization to the community just keeps increasing these days. It's where we go for, diagnostic work, where we go for so many things is this hospital, but the value has been totally dragged towards this individual patient kind of metrics. So the hospitals hate it. And they try and come up with all sorts of different methodologies so that they're not being stopped. This is a good hospital. I understand there's some that are up to no good. I'm not trying to say that, but in an ideal world, right? A hospital is under tremendous pressure to mask these benefits they're providing to the community through these metrics. And so there's been constant tug of war about imposing like criteria about the way that they do the accounting. And they haven't come up with a single one because of this pushback. And I think the recognition that this would be super problematic if it really stuck. You hit a nerve. Sorry, it's a really exciting topic, I think.
Just one follow-up, which might interest you, or I'm sure you probably already know this, but I had a conversation with the person who is in charge of the administration of the research program at one of our major hospital systems here. And I said, for purposes of calculating your community benefit for not-for-profit purposes, what rules, how do you calculate, are there rules about how you calculate what you spend on research? And guess what she said? No.
Well, okay. The community benefit stuff is really interesting, and I think could really inform the accounting project I'm on, right? What he's referring to there is that for a long time, nonprofit hospitals were supposed to generate a community benefit to justify their nonprofit status, but the IRS was kind of letting it go based on this revenue ruling from 1969 or something that just said, you're a hospital, you have a community benefit, right? But then they were doing all that bill collecting and being really mean to everyone. And states were like, we're not liking you, do more. And so there's been a development of a much more robust expectation, right? That you show concrete things. You have to have like community meetings and devise plans to identify and address the concerns the community has and everything. And so, no, they're not concrete, but they're a lot more interesting than they were 10 years ago. Like in terms of doing this. But what's interesting too is it has nothing to do with those metrics of individual patient care. It could be that you've set up an apartment complex for people who need step down care because they have no family to go home to, and you're just like housing them through these rehabilitation times. It could be your lice treatment plans you have for people who are unhomed. You know what I mean? It's expansive and interesting because it doesn't track this other accounting methodology and what it's expecting hospitals to show in their metrics to show that they're functioning well financially. That disconnect, I'd love to hear what they say about that disconnect because I think that's really interesting. I'm sorry if I sound too hyper about this. I know that talking about accounting like kills people, but it's really fun. I really encourage you to look at the rhetoric of accounting, like in the things that you're interested in policy, and see how it spills over into this. And it's kind of distorting a lot of the debates we have because we're so passive, like in accepting these numbers as being like apples in a barrel.
There were a bunch
Yes.
of questions on Q&A, I think.
I have a question. I appreciate your passion for this. I'm currently working on my law note and I've been following the money and just exec boards, and I feel like a madman. I have charts all over my office, but how do you address the revolving door between the SEC and IRS to private sector? And actually, there's several articles that I just found just quickly looking between people in Congress calling out the IRS for, kind of being in bed with these giant accounting firms and auditing. And it seems like this is it's kind of a loop that seems like it might be difficult to actually put together a new accounting system to actually calculate healthcare related costs and such.
So there is an international agreed upon metric for healthcare accounting. It's accounts in healthcare that was revised in 2011 and has meetings. It's very complex, and we were signatories to it. We generate two separate sets of accounting balances. One is the American system, and one is our participation in the system of accountings 2011. So the technical qualities of this, while highly political, are different than the revolving door problem I think that you're describing. That doesn't mean they're not related, but there is room for, like, if we got too far off base, I think the distinction in those numbers would start to show a problem with our system. And my proposals will be directed towards the international system more so than the American one. The laws I'm looking to change are more American laws because that's our jurisdiction, right, that I'm writing in. But the problems I'm describing are happening all over the world with this. But as to the revolving door generally, not so much specifically about devising accounting standards, but what gets counted and how it gets counted, which is slightly different, if you see what I mean. Right? The healthcare system is such an insane amount of money, right? And when I'm teaching my students about it, I talk about it like a raging river, like, or a huge like spigot that's open, right? And to get rich, you just need to divert the tiniest little bit of it, right, off into your area. And so the incentive for very smart people to do very smart things to divert that money off is really, really high. I think it's just a structural problem we have. Because it's just so much money. You know what I mean? And so there's this constant whack-a-mole reactivity stance you kind of have to take. I mean, it might be fraud and abuse. It might be these other forms of financialization. As long as you have that torrent of money flowing, you're going to have that incentive. It's like really, really smart people going to tax law, right? Because you're going to get paid a lot of money to be creative and come up with ways of protecting people from tax liability. It's I don't know, it just seems to be a function of how we do things here. I do think that coming up with an ethical framework that requires justification, no, it's not going to stop that. I think it's just a problem. It's just, I don't see any way that that's not going to happen because we have so many people who need healthcare. I think we just need to be ready for it. What do you think, Max?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions because we need to end at 1:55. So if you have time, do you have time, Jay?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm enjoying this. This is helpful for me, honestly, because I'm still in the edits on this article. And so I want to make sure, you know, if you have any thoughts too, if you have a chance to read any of this or would like a draft to give me comments, it'd be very welcome.
Great. So we have another question from online, and you were asked, what effect will most favored nation pricing have on the healthcare system? And how else will private companies recoup their costs?
You mean the Trump administration proposal for matching European drug prices? Is that what that is? The most favored nation?
The most favored nations would, I think, perhaps be that if one company has a low price on something, another company would be able to get a price match from that most favored nations clause. And yeah, and then from there, how do you recoup costs? I believe is what the question was asking.
So you mean like if I sell something at one price, someone else can buy it at that price from me?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, got it. There are a lot of things happening right now in federal law. So if you look at the Cures Act and if you look at the drug negotiation criteria, it's actually similar to something I'd written really early in my career about what I thought went into fair pricing. So of course I love it, to be open about my bias. But what I love about it is I think it starts to reflect what real people do when they're really considering pricing, okay? Like they want to know, how much did you actually spend to develop this, right? How much money did the federal government give you for research, like to do it? How much money have you actually already made? What does it cost you to make the drug, like the actual cost? So you're getting a sense really of how much money is really in play here. And the guidelines for the pricing is like fair and reasonable. It's not saying cheap or unreasonable. And the way I like to think about it, I remember when I was coming up through law school and stuff, law and economics was like really big, you know, that was sort of the way things did things. And I remember learning about the distinction between pigs and hogs. Have you all ever learned about that? Where they say that pigs get fat and hogs get slaughtered. And I think what we've been dealing with currently with pricing is somewhere between pigs and hogs. And I think what the law now is trying to do is get it between reasonable and pigs. So it's not going to stop you from making a lot of money. It's trying to stop the pig hog being the framing that we're looking at and getting more to reasonable pig. That's at least how I'm reading the language there. I mean, I get that people have concerns about disincentives, that any kind of price control would function as a disincentive, but I think they're very overstated. I think if you look at the actual terminology that's being debated right now, no one is talking about not letting people get a robust return. I just think there is a distinction between a pig and a hog, and that the law is trying to capture that, and a lot of the rhetoric is trying to capture that. That's at least what I'm thinking. Because look at who gets dragged up in front of Congress and screamed at, right? It's the hog. It's not someone who's just making a lot of money. They're like, oh, yay, you're in our state. That's great. Build another factory.
Great. Thank you. We have one more quick question, and then I think we've got to wrap up. But some of the participants would love to know where your article will be available to read.
So it's going to be in the, what did I say? I always get it confused. There are two journals. This is the American Journal of Law and Medicine. So it's AJLM, and it's coming out in the winter. And I should be posting a draft on SSRN when I get the next round of edits back, because to be honest, my blue booking was a nightmare on this, and bless them. It was written kind of quickly, that part. So we're working on getting that under control with my research assistants. But if anyone would like to look at a draft right now, just shoot me an email. I'll send you one. But for citations, I think you probably need to wait for it to come out in its thing. And don't hold me on how bad the citations are. I know they're horrible. They're getting better by the day.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This was excellent and very thought-provoking. Good luck on your work and your editing. And thank you. Let me have a round of applause.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed this. You guys asked great questions, and it was just super fun. I appreciate it a lot.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.